Hi, I'm Wendy Turner, Executive Director of Michigan Public. You might have heard that public media is under threat. You're not wrong. But I come to tell you that your voice has power. Visit protectmypublicmedia.org, contact your lawmakers, and take a stand today.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
The Ottawa Impact made national headlines when the controversial ultra-conservative coalition took over control of the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners.
This past election, though, they lost their majority on the board. Today, the executive editor of the new Ottawa News Network is here to let us know what we should be watching for in the year ahead.
But first,
Michiganders elected both me and Donald Trump twice.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer delivered what she's calling her Road Ahead address earlier this month. And the big focus, how she's going to work with Republicans, whether it's in the state house or the new president.
Now, I don't want to pretend we're always going to agree, but I will always seek collaboration first.
So what is the current role of the Democratic Party, the loyal opposition?
There's been a lot made of the fact that the liberal resistance seems weaker and less inspired than during the first Trump term. Two folks are here to explain what is really going on. Adrian Hemond is CEO of Grassroots Midwest. He's worked in Democratic politics for decades. Hello, Adrian.
Thanks for having me.
And Portia Roberson, CEO of Focus Hope, former Justice Department official in the Obama administration and former Democratic candidate herself. Hello, Portia.
Hello there.
So, Adrian, first, let's set the table. How are Democrats feeling?
Depends on the Democrat, right? Obviously, Democrats had a bad election year. There are a variety of reasons for that, but we're looking forward. And so there's been an effort to sort of pick up the pieces and figure out what comes next. And that looks different for different Democrats. But I think for a lot of elected Democrats, what it looks like is figuring out how they navigate the next 2 years where they have significantly less power than they did just a couple months ago.
Portia, same question.
I think that's exactly right. I would say that a lot of Democrats are just exhausted. I think that we sort of underestimated the fact that people were going to respond or we would be here again. I do think that as things continue to unfold, we're only days into this new administration. I think people will get more energized again and come back to the table, willing to lay down the gauntlet and say, we've got to fight some of these things. I think there are some scary things happening right now. And I think that will be somewhat of the motivation around why people will get more involved again.
Adrian, think back 8 years ago. There were marches, fundraising was up, candidates were quick to speak up. Why is there this difference from 8 years ago?
I actually kind of dispute that there's that much of a difference from 8 years ago. Democrats were despondent after the 2016 election because unlike this election, most Democrats, frankly, most Americans assumed that there was very little chance that Donald Trump was going to win. That wasn't the case this time. But as you recall, 8 years ago, Hillary Clinton had basically been anointed president in advance of the election. And so there was this sense of shock from Democrats. It took a little while for them to really get organized and for all of these left-leaning outside groups and nonprofits to get themselves organized in response to the Trump administration. What prompted action last time and what is likely to prompt action from Democrats this time is actions that the Trump administration takes. We saw that with the pause on grants. All of a sudden, a lot of people are mobilized. We've seen that some with the immigration issue where people are starting to mobilize around that. So I think that in terms of the issue-specific communities and groups out there, we're starting to see that. And I expect that we're going to see some more of it over time.
Right now, it's flooding the zone. And we actually asked Jason Rowe, he's a Republican political consultant, about this.
The fury of executive orders and personnel changes and things that he unleashed in that first week has kept them on their heels. I think there's too much going on, too many molecules bouncing around to get a critical mass of focus on any one thing that he's doing. And I think that's making it really difficult to find their footing and find a line of attack.
Portia, you're talking to Democratic political insiders. Is this what you're hearing?
Yeah, but I also think, listen, the messaging and the fight, if you want to call it that, has to be an organized one that actually moves the needle. I'm not upset by the fact that it seems as though it's taking a little longer. If we are just running from one crisis to the next without some sort of organization, then we'll just spend the next 2 years, if not 4 years, just spinning our wheels and not getting anything done and not being effective in our messaging to why they should respond to the Democratic Party and why they need to be a part of this movement, this fight, this effort. So I actually think it's not a bad thing that we have not started to rush out and try to fight everything that's coming, because honestly, I think a little bit of that chaos is exactly what this administration wants to create, because the more chaos that is created on our end, the more we can organize to fight back against some of the policies that might be coming.
But everyone knew what we were getting into. Why do you think politicians, especially like Gretchen Whitmer comes to mind, are playing it so cool right now?
So I think a big part of what's going on here is that Democrats are in the process of learning some hard lessons from the last election. One of those lessons is that the message that Democrats were putting out, especially nationally, but we saw it here in Michigan, it was the only state legislative chamber to flip against Democrats in the entire country. The message that we were putting out there to voters was not what was important to them. Like, we were talking about a lot of stuff, we spent a lot of money, and the voters largely didn't care. There was a disconnect between what was important to voters and what we were talking about. And what's important to voters is, by and large, stuff that affects their life directly. I always say when I'm teaching campaign trainings to candidates, the number one thing that you have to answer for each voter is, what's in it for me if you win? And Democrats did a bad job with that last time. Part of what has to happen for Democrats to figure out what they need to focus on from a political perspective is that people actually need to experience the impact of policies, not just be told that Donald Trump is bad.
One of the things that I'm very curious about, Portia, is this sense of Democrats maybe holding back a little bit to allow Trump to be Trump. The latest Quinnipiac polls just from last month, 51% of folks oppose tariffs. Only 36% prefer deporting most undocumented immigrants in the U.S. A majority of voters, 63%, think that all children born in the U.S. should continue to be automatically granted citizenship. 59% oppose President Trump pardoning all of the convicted for their involvement in January 6th. 53% disapprove of Elon Musk's role in the Trump administration. Is there a sense of just sort of let Trump be Trump and let the American people decide eventually?
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of that. I think the reality of it is we're already seeing some folks having regrets over their vote, because I think there were some folks who thought that despite him telling us exactly what he was going to do, that somehow it wasn't going to affect them. And so they sort of sat back and said, he won't be that bad. And they're starting to realize that maybe some of these things will be bad for them. And I think it's not lost on Democrats that if he continues to do or have these policies that affect everyday working people in very negative ways, if we don't see eggs prices go down, if we don't see if prescription drug prices are raised again, then the thought may be that people will start to come back to the Democratic Party or look at their options in a more realistic way, that maybe this idea that his messaging was good or his messaging was attractive to people, but when put into policy and actual governing, it wasn't as great for people as they expected.
Portia, I want to stick with you just for another minute. One of the things I'm curious about, too, for some Democrats is a sense of them saying, look, they worked really hard in this last election. They're exhausted. They say we need a break to just regroup, a break, not just from the labor, but the emotional labor, to just tap out for a minute.
Yeah, no, it's very, very real. I mean, Black women as a whole, and I'm one of them, talks about, being part of the 92% and how I did two things. I posted about, I was going to take care of myself for a while. That didn't last long. I'm already starting to get involved again. But also, I changed my profile pic to Michelle Obama after she announced she wasn't going to the inauguration, because basically Black women who have been the backbone of the Democratic Party in many ways and at many times just said, we tried to tell you over and over again that the things that he said he was going to do, he's going to do. And so people don't want to listen. And here we are. And we woke up and it's starting to get bad. I do think that many of us feel, and when I say us, I'm talking again about Black women, feel and understand that many of the policies that may be put forth will affect us in large ways. And so I don't foresee that we will stick to this idea of sitting it out. I think that we will see people come back and get involved and figure out where they can have the most impact. But I do think, quite honestly, the Democrats have to have a good message. I mean, we get in a bubble because we really are involved in and talk about politics all the time and think about politics all the time. But there are so many people for whom this is not something that they're even remotely interested in. And so I think we're going to have to figure out how we're speaking to them. And I think part of that is going to be listening to them. They will tell you what the issues are that you need to be addressing. But we've been too focused on telling them the other guy's a bad guy. And we know that you won't vote for that bad guy again, and you'll just vote for us. And that didn't work.
Adrian, I see you basically out of your seat, jumping up and down.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I think the most important thing there is listening to voters. I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of Democrats since the election that are not involved in politics, but know what I do for a living. And the question that I ask a lot of these folks is, in the last month, how many people have you interacted with for more than 10 minutes that didn't go to college and are not providing a service to you? Right? And I know a whole lot of Democrats that are answering that with a number that's in the low single digits. Some of them zero. But the fact of the matter is that 2/3 of America didn't go to college, 2/3 of American adults, and college attainment's as high as it's ever been. I think that Democrats should spend some time talking to people who will tell you that they're Democrats who didn't go to college, but what's important to them and what's important to the people that they interact with every day.
First of all, I am doing the same thing, like lifting out of my chair, shaking my head, like he's right, he's right, he's right. I have to get out of these circumstances where we're only talking amongst ourselves and we don't ask anybody what their issues are. I ultimately feel like if you do that, you'll find that there's a lot more in common than there is different, but you cannot keep talking to the same people that you've always talked to and think you now have covered the bulk of the Democratic Party. I mean, when I'm talking to people about some of our education programs, the first thing I say is like, this is not just an urban issue. There are kids in rural areas that aren't being educated in the way that they need to be prepared for the next century of work. We have to stop making it only inclusive to certain groups of folks and actually point out to people that rural, urban, suburban, I know it sounds a little kumbaya, but we all really do want the same things. And we got to listen to people when they tell us what they're interested in, what their concerns are, and make that our messaging and not all the things that we as political people like to come up with and tell them our message should be.
That is Portia Roberson, CEO of Focus Hope, former Justice Department official in the Obama administration, and former Democratic candidate herself, joined by Adrian Hemond. He is CEO of Grassroots Midwest and also has worked in Democratic politics for decades. Thank you so much to both of you. We will have you both back on in a few months to check in about this so-called Democratic resistance and where things stand right now.
See how it's going.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Over the past 2 years, Ottawa County politics has made national headlines, and not necessarily for good.
I think that what is unusual is that we're seeing a trickle down of the dynamics of national politics into local politics, which is pretty atypical for a small town.
That's Sarah Leach. She's been covering Ottawa County for a long time.
And so that playing out where there's a lot of these ideas that are more based on ideology than practicality, I think has created a really unique situation here.
Sarah is now the executive editor of a new outfit. It is called the Ottawa News Network.
And she's continuing her coverage of the Ottawa Impact Coalition. This is a group now in the minority on the county commission that basically courted controversy after controversy, stuff like firing or trying to fire county officials.
And the county, that is taxpayers, having to pay county dollars because of it.
So I wanted to chat with Sarah about what Ottawa County politics are going to look like in this new year. But before we looked ahead, I asked Sarah to just remind us of how we got to this point.
Well, really, it goes back to the COVID-19 pandemic, where after we had some of those state mandates of social distancing and some of the mask mandates that we saw in K through 6 schools, there was a lot of frustration by parents. And in Ottawa County in particular, they demanded that the county commission not follow some of those mandates. And at the time, the commissioners were really ill-equipped to handle that kind of a question. So they heavily relied on their legal counsel to tell them what they were supposed to do, who then informed them that they weren't able to defy those orders. They weren't able to fire the health officer who was following those orders. And that really created an upswell of anger. And then a political action committee was formed and a bunch of candidates were recruited. And they sort of rode that wave of how the government was overreaching and trampling on parental rights. So that's what ultimately got Ottawa Impact elected in 2022.
And then what?
Well, they had 7 seats on an 11-seat board. And what we saw on the very first day, the very first meeting was January 3rd, 2023. And even though we were prepared for a huge shift in government perspective, so to say, we were really taken off guard by the magnitude of some of the decisions. They fired the county administrator, they fired the corporation counsel, they tried to fire the health officer. It was a really broad, sweeping announcement that they were here, that they were in charge, and that they were going to do things very, very differently.
All this is happening. Ottawa County is making national headlines in the New York Times, the Washington Post. You're working for the Holland Sentinel, owned by Gannett, and they lay you off in April. But you're back now with the creation of the Ottawa News Network. Tell us about ONN.
ONN is a county-wide news nonprofit model. The idea is to serve the county as a whole rather than focus on just individual pockets, which community newspapers tend to do. We believe in sharing information that is free so that people can make informed decisions about their lives. And we think that people will see the value in that work and will financially support it.
And now, Sarah, what should we expect this year in Ottawa County politics?
A lot of people have asked me that. I think that it's going to be even more fascinating now than it was before, because before we had one group that was sort of just controlling every single aspect of the conversation and the decisions. And now we have a much more politically diverse representation on the county commission. So in 2024, several of the Ottawa Impact commissioners lost their bids for re-election. So now they're actually in the minority. They only hold 4 seats on the 11-member board, and there's 1 Democrat, and the rest are non-OI, what I call traditional Republicans. Now that you have a lot of diversity of opinion, you're going to have a lot longer conversations about decision making. And I think that that's going to be even more interesting than it was before in terms of OI sort of running the gambit.
How?
Well, I think they have to figure out how they're going to level set because, frankly, OI's leadership got us sued 7 times within 2 years. 3 of those lawsuits are still active. So obviously that's a huge consideration. And despite their claims that they believe in limited government and wise spending of tax dollars, we have spent probably close to $3.5 million in either expanded programs, departments, and payouts and settlements and severance packages. So there's a real concern about the financial aspect of the county and whether or not our triple bond rating could be at risk because of some of these decisions.
The indomitable Sarah Leach, executive editor of the Ottawa News Network. Sarah, congrats on the creation of ONN, and thanks so much for the time.
Thank you.
And quickly, before we wrap up today, as you political watchers no doubt already know, Senator Gary Peters announced this week that he is not going to run for re-election. It is a pretty seismic decision that is really going to completely reshape the race for open statewide seats in Michigan in 2026. Rick and I jumped on stateside yesterday to talk with April Baer about the consequences of Peters' decision. You can find the conversation at michiganpublic.org. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.